Hans Niemann is back in action, and in this video I'm going to show you the game he played in round 1 of the Turkish Team Championship. Hans is playing with the white pieces against Gleb Dudin. It's a Russian grandmaster nowadays representing Hungary. He's only 1 year younger than Hans, and the two know each other pretty well. They have played 3 games so far. Hans is leading 2-1. And the last game they played was only a few months ago at the Sharjah Masters, game that Hans managed to win. But of course, when you know each other pretty well, you can imagine that Gleb Dudin is out for revenge. So let's see what's happening in this game, and hopefully I will be able to cover more games from Hans playing in this very strong team event in Turkey. Anyway, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for doing that, guys. You can also help the channel to grow by give this video a like or make a small PayPal donation, as you can find in the link below. Thanks for that. Now, here we go with the game played by Hans. Hans is opening the game with 1 e4, and we have, after the move c5, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, the so-called Rossolimo variation, which is nowadays probably even more popular than the lines arising from the open Sicilian. g6, bishop takes knight to create an imbalance of knight versus bishop, and black recaptures with the b pawn, so he will have double pawns, and who knows, maybe these pawns, they can prove to become vulnerable later on. White castles, bishop g7, and here it's the move rook to e1. Well, this is all pretty standard theory. In the past, people used to play here the move knight f6. This is playable, but after something like e5, white is grabbing quite some nice space. So instead of the move knight f6, people have started to play here the move queen c7. It's kind of a useful waiting move, and to see what white is going to do. Because, for instance, if you do play something like c3, which is what Hans faced actually himself in an earlier game, one of the main ideas for black is to go for the move d6, and then after knight f6, castling kingside. That is sort of a well-known setup. Now Hans is playing with the white pieces in this game, so he doesn't want to face the exact same line, and he deviates here with an interesting move. He goes for the move knight a3. This may look very strange, but in the Rossolimo it's not a bad idea, because the knight can often come to a c4, and because black no longer has a b pawn, the knight is quite stable potentially on that square, cannot be kicked away by a move like b7, b5. Well, now various options. In an earlier game of Hans against Le Quang Liem, the Vietnamese grandmaster played here the move knight h6. I believe this is a good move. One of the main ideas of developing the knight in this way is to play f6 and then knight f7, and you're pretty solid in the center. I mean, don't forget that even though black has double pawns, an extra pawn in the center can become quite useful for black later on. But okay, knight h6 was not played. d5 was the move in the game. I'm not such a big fan of this move. I understand that with the move d5, you are trying to control the c4 square, so the knight on a3 is out of play, at least for now. But after d3, black can never really use his d-pawn. You never really want to take. You also don't want to push the pawn to d4, because after moving the pawn once again, the knight can come to c4. So black has to find a different way of developing. Knight f6, h3, useful move to cover the g4 square, so the bishop cannot be developed there. And now the move bishop e6 is played. I mean, it's probably the most active square for the bishop, but I'm not sure. I don't like the bishop there at all, and perhaps there were better ways of playing here. But maybe something like knight d7 is an interesting move to open up the diagonal for the bishop, so that it will be harder for white to develop the bishop from c1. But let's see what happened after bishop e6. Now Hans plays pretty straightforward. He goes for knight g5, putting pressure on this bishop, castling kingside, and here you think, okay, you can take on e6 and then second pair of doubled pawns, but there's no rush here as white. Hans played a good move, queen e2. So indirectly putting more pressure against that bishop. So after creating double pawns at some point, maybe the e-file will be opened, and then the queen is pretty well placed there. So objectively, black is still okay, but his next move, h6, I'm not sure about it. It feels like white was planning to take on e6 anyway. So why would you further weaken your own king side as black? Knight takes e6, pawn takes e6, and here the move c3. That's a good move. So taking away all sorts of pressure on this diagonal, and the knight on a3 can get back into play. As after the move king h7, the knight comes to c2, rook f7 played. So probably black is hoping to double rooks on the f-file. But objectively, things are not looking very nice here for black. Bishop e3 played, so that the pawn on c5 is the first target. And how are you going to deal with that? Well, that's a good question. Probably the best move for black is here to play the move c4. And I think c4 is a very good move, as if you take on c4, there's knight takes e4 and the position becomes more open. And okay, white is quite solid, white is probably still a bit better, but there's something to play for as black is quite active. So this was not played by black, but it would have been a good idea to get rid of your weakness on c5. Now we should go back actually one move, as instead of bishop e3, probably more precise is to start with e5, to hit the knight on f6, and after the knight goes away, you're ready to go d4. In that case, probably black is able to undouble the pawns as well, but the main point of having the pawn on e5 is to prove that the bishop on g7 is pretty bad, pretty useless, cannot become really active at all. But after bishop e3, missed opportunity for black to undouble the pawns. He played instead here the move queen a5, defending the pawn. But now e5 is played anyway, attacking the knight on f6. The knight goes to h5. Knight looks pretty bad there, but okay, first of all, the pawn on e5 is threatened to be taken. And at some point, the knight probably can come to f4. So black is looking for ways to generate counterplay. White played the move d4, excellent idea. After taking on d4, probably you're just going to take back with the pawn. If you're really ambitious, you can also consider taking with the knight, as you're hitting weaknesses on c6 and e6. White is in good shape. His position doesn't contain any weaknesses, while black really has to keep fighting, and you see all pawn weaknesses all over the place. Instead of taking on d4, Dudin played here the move knight f4, attacking the queen. And the queen just goes to d2, hitting the knight one more time, rook a f8. And what you have to understand is that taking on c5 is not very attractive, as then the bishop will get back into play, can capture the pawn on e5. So instead of taking on c5, white played excellent move here with b4. Attacking the queen, attacking the pawn on c5 as well. Pawn takes b4 was played. And now, here, interesting moment. What would you do? How would you recapture? With the pawn or with the knight? Hans captured with the knight, and I tend to believe that taking with the pawn is a much more natural move to maintain a grip on the c5 square. After the queen goes away, my plan in such situation would be to play king h2, to prepare the move g3, to kick the knight away. And the reason I play king h2 is to overprotect the pawn on h3. I think that black is positionally busted here. Why? There's no pressure against white's center. The pawn on d4 is excellent. It supports the pawn on e5, which means that there is no hope for the bishop to ever become active again. And white's plan in such situations would be to shift the attention to the queen side, trying to open up files there and probably hit the pawn weakness on c6. So this looks all pretty nice, but as I said, Hans decided to take with the knight, which is also possible as he hits the pawn on c6. Black played the move h5, so trying to activate the bishop. And this is an interesting moment, as white can capture the pawn on c6, but why did white not do that? I mean, after queen a4, maybe there are ideas that after, okay, you're hitting the knight goes back to b4, maybe bishop h6. There are ideas to generate some active play on the queen side, and it will be very difficult for white to use the extra pawn immediately. So that's why Hans didn't capture. What does white actually want to do? Ideally, you would take here with the bishop on f4. But after rook takes f4, now the ideal move is knight d3 to hit the rook on f4 with your knight and queen. If the rook goes away, you have fantastic square on c5. But there is the problem of rook takes d4, winning a very important pawn, as if you do take on d4, the queen on d2 is hanging. So let's get back to the game. Now you understand what Hans Niemann has in mind. He just moved his queen away from d2 to c2. So after the move bishop h6, there is bishop takes f4. This is a very nice positional trade. After bishop recaptures, the knight comes to d3, and the knight is a fantastic piece. It even supports the pawn on f2. So after the bishop goes away, there's nothing, but absolutely nothing the rooks can do on this half-open file. The knight also covers the c5 square, so it's ready to come there very soon. Well, white played here a rook e2, overprotecting the pawn on f2. h4 was played, and now the knight comes in to c5. So here you see that the rook has now replaced the role of the knight to protect the pawn on f2, and the knight on c5 is on its way to pick up the pawn on e6. Now rook b8 was played, looking for counterplay, and if you do take immediately, there's maybe queen a3. It will be harder for white to untangle. If you ever move one of these pieces, you always got to reckon with ideas of black infiltrating on the second rank. So here another classy move by Hans Niemann. He understands that the pawn on e6 is not running away, and therefore he starts with this move a4. Excellent idea, as you want to bring up your pawn anyway. Rook f5 was played, knight takes e6, white is a pawn up, the queen goes to a6, so that after knight c5 the queen goes to c8, but as I said, white is a pawn up. I don't see the compensation here for black at all. What should be white's plan to convert the small material advantage? Try to play on the side where you're stronger. Rook b1 is an excellent move, as you really want to gain control over this file. If black is ever going to trade off one pair of rooks, you take back with the queen. Rook b2 is coming. The rook will come in to b8, and this looks really, really strong for white. So rook b6 is played, so that if you ever take yourself on b6, black is able to take back with the pawn and tickle the knight away from the c5 square. But of course white is not going to take himself. Played here the move a5, excellent move, hitting the rook on b6, rook b5 played, and before black ever gets the chance to cement the b file with a move like a6, here a6 by white is played. Excellent technical move. And well, you're ready to take very soon on b5 anyway. And who knows, maybe even the pawn on a7 later on. If you're able to infiltrate black's position with one of your major pieces, that is going to be a huge weapon, as potentially this a pawn is about to become a new queen. Well, rook takes c5 was played. This is looking like a desperate move. Why did black sacrifice the exchange? Well, if you play queen b8, for instance, threatening to take on b1, rooks are coming off the board. If you take back with the queen, the rook will come back to e1. Now, there's no longer any pressure against the pawn on f2. Rook b1 is going to be played, and that's exactly the sort of plan I've mentioned already. The rook wants to come in, and then the pawns on e7 and a7 are really weak. Instead of taking back with the queen, taking back with the pawn is another possibility. But after queen b3, once again, you do see that there are too many weaknesses for black to deal with. So positionally, black is completely crushed here. That explains the exchange sacrifice. But black doesn't really get enough compensation. Rook takes c5, pawn takes c5, queen takes a6. At least black succeeds in trading off the annoying pawn. How should white win this? Well, you are having an extra rook. How to use the extra rook? Create open files. And the key move here is c4. Wonderful idea. to open up the position. If you take, for instance, with the queen, everything can be swapped, and very soon you wrap up the pawn or the rook can come into b7. That is absolutely hopeless. Black, instead of taking with the queen, decided to take with the pawn, but now it's rook e4. That is the second idea. The pawn has been deflected from the d5 square. That means the rook is excellently placed, hits the pawn on h4, hits the pawn on c4 as well. Bishop f4, queen takes. Now you're even hitting the bishop on f4 and the queen, so the queen exchange cannot be avoided. Rook takes. If you take with the bishop on e5, rook b7 comes, and well, white will be winning as well. g5 played. You may, of course, consider a move like rook b7, but there are always ideas with rook takes e5. White started with e6, good move, trying to keep the pawn. Rook e5 played, and as I said, don't go with the rook to the 7th rank. This time it would be even checkmate, so that is the sort of final, you cannot even call it a trick, but sort of last hope Black is playing for. Instead of rook b7, just first king f1 to cover the e1 square. Black played a5, rook now goes to b7, hits the pawn on e7, rook takes e6, defends the pawn, but Black's pawns are really weak. Rook c2 is a very good move. After rook e4, now the pawn on c6 is unprotected as well. Rook b6 played, so you're about to take that pawn and push the c pawn immediately. Rook e6 back, rook e2, trying to initiate the exchange of rooks, after which it will be much easier for white to convert the advantage. Bishop e5, rook a6, attacking the pawn on the a file. King g6, the king is coming closer, defends both the rook and bishop, but now rook a6 again, and you see that it's very difficult to do something here as Black. If you ever move the bishop, and rook takes rook, and after that the pawn on c6 is falling. Rook f6 played, rook e3, with ideas maybe to go rook f3 at some point. Bishop d4 was played. There's not much you can really do here as Black. Rook f3 would already force the exchange of rooks. It's absolutely fine. Instead, rook takes pawn was played. If you now take on c5, there is rook a5 with a very nice pin. You're winning the bishop on c5. So instead, Black's last move of the game is king g6, trying to generate counterplay against the pawn on f2. But after rook e2, Dudin had seen enough. He resigned here, as he is a pawn down and doesn't really have a chance here to win the pawn back. If you take on c5, well, there is rook c2. After the bishop goes away, you take on c6. You do initiate the exchange of rooks, and with an extra pawn and an extra exchange, well, that's just totally game over. So I think Hans Niemann totally outplayed his opponent from an opening he knows quite a lot of, has experience playing it with both colors, and definitely he understood the position better and outplayed Dudin in a nice positional way. So let me know, please, in the comments, what do you think of this game? Is Hans really going to reach the top 20 in the world? I'm not sure on which place he exactly is, but he is over 2,700. So he is, well, in the very top already, but let's see how far he can get in his next tournament. So stay tuned for more updates on this channel. Please subscribe, turn on the notifications. Thanks for all your support, guys, and we see each other very soon again. Bye bye.